Welcome to the Strength Lab podcast. I am your host, Tyler Ramsey, and my guest is Alec Pagan. He is a strength coach ranging from top level strongman and women to Olympic lifting. He's got 14 years in the business and he's got his own team, RPE 11.
Yeah, that's me.
Yeah. Thanks
Thanks
for
for having
hopping
me on,
on.
buddy. Of course.
I would say your top two, well, that most people would know would be Lucas Hatton and Inez Carastillo. Is that correct?
Yeah, I would say I got people started paying attention to my coaching. I coached Erin Murray for her three first world titles,
Okay.
coached Gabby Dixon, and I coached Lucas Hatton and Inez Carrasquillo.
Yeah. Lucas has had a good year and a half so far.
Yeah,
Second place at Strongest Man on Earth in 2024.
third
Third,
place.
third. And then he just got second at the
Yeah,
Arnold.
that's right. Yeah.
And then Nez got first place.
Yeah, Inez she finally took that crown. She's making her the first athlete to win both majors for the women's side,
Nice.
the
Nice.
Rogue and the Arnold.
Yes. Yes. I would like to announce my new partnership with Titan Nutrition.
Okay.
They're a new supplement brand, highly respected in the industry. They have products ranging from pre workout, vitamins, and protein. You can check them out on their website at titannutrition.net. And if you wanted to make an order, you can use Ramsey Strength at checkout for 20% off your order. I will link all that in the description. So we will go ahead and start with training and a little bit of strength development questions.
Sure.
Um, a lot of this has to do with strongman, but you can also answer based on general population people too. So what are the foundational lifts and movements every strongman or athlete should master?
Sure. I would deviate from the idea of just individual lifts, like certain exercises, like specifically exercises, and I would be more focused on movement patterns.
Okay.
And the primary movement patterns will be upper body uh, pushing and pulling, specifically vertically, and lower body hinging and pushing. And that will basically dictate every single movement that exists for the most part in the gym. And then outside of that, you have things in the frontal plane and the sagittal plane, but that's what I would predominantly focus on.
Do you think like carrying implements do you think that's an important thing that people should
Yeah,
do,
yeah.
not
So
just for strongman?
yeah, I mean, and then continuing on from there, once those basics are kind of covered or at least practiced, you have any form of locomotion is going to be incredibly important, whether it's loaded or otherwise. It doesn't have to be loaded to be effective, but yeah, locomotion in general in various directions is incredibly important.
Yeah, I know they have come out with a lot of information about people that carry, do farmer carry dumbbells and stuff like that. That grip strength is usually super helpful to like extend your lifetime. They have a lot of results and research on that.
Yeah, and a lot of those studies have to do with grip strength as a whole. And generally speaking, people who have strong hands are generally just moving more than the average person. And that's kind of really the more causation of those studies, if I had to guess. But yes, there is definitely evidence to suggest that just having stronger hands, specifically when moving, just lends towards a longer life and just a
Yeah.
stronger human.
Yeah, and I just watched a video with Mitchell Hooper. He was at some convention or something, and he was talking about that the triceps are super important too, with the research that like pushing out of a chair, getting out of a car, that kind of thing. So having strong triceps could help people live a little bit longer and have that access to get out of things in certain
Yeah,
situations.
Yeah, I mean, one of my first coaches and mentors is a guy named Dan Trink, and he ultimately said to me one day, if you have an incredibly strong lower back and incredibly strong hands, you could get away with a lot more than you deserve.
Nice. And who is that?
A gentleman named Dan Trink.
Okay.
He's an exercise scientist out of New York City and owns Fortitude Strength Club in New York City, which is a
Okay.
three or four gym operation out of the city there.
Nice. How do you structure a strongman training week for beginners versus an elite athlete? So how would you do like
Yeah,
how would you
that's that's a big question.
yeah,
So beginners, ultimately, you're going to be covering those basics that I suggested before, upper body vertically pushing and pulling, lower body hinging and pushing, and just the basics. Like just most beginners in anything, especially when they come into a strength sport, I think most people will be alarmed how many people are just new to lifting weights in general, never mind the sport. So the predominant work of their time, really the first 4 or 5 years, is going to be just accumulation of just good tissue, like whether it be
yeah,
muscle fibers, tendon qualities, and then from there applying just basic principles that we suggested already to it, right? So it's going to be quite linear. It's not going to be, be the very basics, sets of 10 and 8s and things like that. That everyone, because everyone's always looking for specifics in terms of like rep ranges and stuff. But ultimately, they should be doing a lot of hypertrophy and a lot of moving, a whole lot of moving, because a lot of adults, some of which didn't, do sports in high school. So just the concept of just running proper running mechanics is incredibly important. So
Yeah.
the beginner individual is going to do a lot of just basic things and usually in a lot of high repetition outside of dangerous stuff, of course, like heavy yokes. Don't do that. Don't do that in high repetition. But in the advanced athlete, it's far more acute. It's far more particular because it has to be, especially when you're pushing athletes to true 1% level. In particular cases, like weight class athletes, that's even more very acute training because you could easily, one, outgrow your class and two, overdo it.
Yeah.
So their program designed to be far more undulating, be ups and downs intentionally, to allow, not only their physical body to recover, muscles and tendons again, but their central nervous system to recover. So it's it's interesting. In a way, it's less total volume, but because of the tonnage, it's a lot more work.
Yeah. The intensity is very great.
It can be, yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it has to be, you know, governed pretty specifically. Whereas with a beginner, you basically can hit them over the head with sets of tens quite often, and they're going to be fine because the loads are light.
Yeah. Their nervous system's not going to be as crazy, like
No, they're going to be dealing a
hit
lot more
hard.
with muscular fatigue and tendon
Yeah.
fatigue, whereas the advanced athlete will still have those things, but it's far more, well, this load could literally break your spine. So we need to be quite careful how we go about program design. Yeah.
When you mentioned the nervous system, can you describe to someone that may not know what that feeling or what that is?
Yeah, so anytime you hear central nervous system, like besides it being sound like a dorky term, they're just people are just referring to your spine. It's just your spine. Like that is your central nervous system. It's the entirety of your spine. And when you do a lot of axial loading, which is loading of your spine, whether it be on your back or otherwise, you get real sleepy. You get real tired. Your body's ability to produce force or speed is reduced considerably. So that's what people are referring to when they're talking about the central nervous system.
Okay. So when would you say that you follow a certain periodization or do you kind of switch it? Like, do you do a lot of undulating? Do you do a linear program? Do you do conjugate? Do you mix them all in different phases or how do you
Yeah,
do
that's a
that?
good question, right? Because it's kind of confusing for those, 'cause generally speaking, 'cause like someone like yourself, I'd imagine, who's more in the intermediate to advanced stages, you start hearing all these terms and structures and whatever. At the end of the day, the answer is it depends, right? That's kind of going to be the golden answer to basically everything. But
Yeah.
when it comes to program design, you have to just meet the athlete where they're at. And when it comes to me, at this point, I predominantly work with advanced athletes.
Mhm.
Um, it follows a model. Basically, I don't care what anyone says to you. Almost all training models come from the Soviet system. All
Yeah.
of them, every single one. And then any single one that's not that has just been a deviation, right? The Soviets basically spent a whole lot of their time and money right after, I think it was right after it was in Olympics in the 40s or early 50s. A few Soviet coaches talked to a few American coaches at York Barbell in the USA. And they were basically asking them, how are you guys winning everything? And short answer was steroids. But with the Soviets, it's true. That
Yeah.
was the short answer. But what the Soviets ended up doing is obviously they utilized the use of performance enhancing drugs, but they then started getting more scientific in that. They hired and produced an incredible wealth of exercise scientists and produced all of these incredible studies throughout the 50s, 60s, and even 70s. And ultimately, what it produces is a system that is tailored around controlling volume thresholds through undulating patterns and prioritizing speed work in certain elements. Now, things like conjugate took the speed work and went way far with it, but conjugate is just a deviation of the Soviet system. So that's basically where all loading patterns come from. Whether you're talking about Prilepin's charts, the French contrast system, Charles Poliquin's methods, it's all deviations of that, and some have hyperfixations on like hypertrophy or speed or power, but it's kind of where the root comes from. So to answer your question, how do I go about it? Well, I follow Soviet principles quite closely, and I just monitor volume thresholds through basic hypertrophy lenses, and then my work in Olympic weightlifting and later in life research on track and field is just more force production work, how to get more explosivity out of an athlete. So, you can kind of just view the answer through that.
Yeah. I know I watched a video with you and Lucas and he was kind of like in a deload part and you had him doing a lot of speed work. Do you just do speed work on deload? ish type
No.
weeks, or you do that even in like a middle of like a full training
Oh, it's
cycle?
all throughout the whole blocks.
Okay.
Throughout, especially if we're talking about the last 12 weeks leading to a show, it's throughout the whole block, littered throughout it. And, Lucas is just doing, what do you say, speeds work? Yes, our intention is to be fast on a deload, but ultimately it's just much lighter load that is
Yeah.
just allowing the body
Yeah.
to recover.
I mean, he's
That's
squatting, crazy weights. So anything that would be heavy to anybody else is just light for
Yeah,
him.
for someone like
So
him, yeah, I mean, his
yeah,
total tonnage is quite high. I mean, we're talking about an athlete who could probably squat 1,000 pounds raw, right? So it's a very different thing.
yeah. Uh, how can athletes improve their strength and explosiveness in strongman training?
Well, that's another big question. How can it improve? Well, I'm a huge proponent. If you're talking about strongman training, usually people are referring to peaking for a show, right?
Yeah,
There's usually a goal in mind, a very specific goal on a very specific date, with usually anywhere from 5 to fucking 10 events. So how to stay fast and strong during that period of time, I'm a huge proponent of less is more. I think people will be alarmed by how little volume certain athletes at the highest level do. Some do a lot, and some do very little, and they're more poignant with their training. They're more precise. So basically, you need to find your MRV, your maximal recoverable volume threshold, right? Everyone needs to find that. And then once you find, okay, once I can work within these thresholds, you can start playing with the amount of work that you do weekly to then make sure that you're recovered for the more important thing, which in this particular case is the events,
yeah,
right? And that's ultimately what people have to do. And if you're not sure how to find your MRV, well, just think about back on your training notes when you're really, really sore and you couldn't operate. All right, well, cut 10% off there. And there's great literature on this as well. I mean, Juggernaut Training Methods has put out a book on this exact thing before. So, there's ways in which people could find that.
yeah. My coach has really dialed me back. He was my first person on my podcast, Alec over in
Okay.
England. He's a strongman at the 90 kg class too.
Yep.
But his coach is Shane.
Yep.
So uh, we've really focused on fatigue management a lot. I was kind of before him, I was just going balls to the wall all the time. No
Like most
deloads,
strong.
nothing. And eventually, either you get really sick and your body's just toast or you get injured. So that fatigue
Yeah,
management
I get it.
is huge.
I spent years squatting to maximum 5 days a week. I get
Yeah.
it. Like, I know what the ringer is like, but ultimately you don't have to do that. Not in
Yeah.
strong, at least.
For specific event training, do you do that after like a main movement or do you have its own day? Like Atlas Stones or
Hmm.
Yoke or Farmers, do you do that on a day after a movement or is it on the same day?
Well, that's a good question. It could be both. The answer is both. Again, like the answer is it depends. But to give you an example, let's say you're 12 weeks out and you know that the finish of the stone load where, talking about from lap to extension is where you're weak, right? Well, you don't necessarily have to be training stones for 12 weeks to be good at stones, especially if you don't have access to them or if it just beats up your forearms too much or whatever. So exercises to help emulate that or on that day that you would train them are pretty important, especially leading into a show. So, for example, you could do something like I refer to it as a strongman power clean, which is essentially just a banded SSB extension,
Hmm.
um,
Is that
anteriorly
where you
loaded.
squat down and have it
Yeah,
like a
basically.
zercher?
Yes, quite similar. And you could do something like that to emulate the movement, but to work on the areas in the movement where you happen to be weak. Because of the accommodating resistance on that exercise and the load being anteriorly loaded, you could practice quite literally extending and creating power in production. So then the next block of training, instead of starting with that, you start with your stones, you start applying those principles. So the answer is it depends. It could even be the same day, it could be an accessory to your stones as well, in which case, obviously, the total tonnage or the weight used would be less because it's after the stones. But there's ways to incorporate it isolated or with it or so on, whatever.
Yeah, that's awesome. I've seen Lucas post a video or maybe you posted a video of him doing that.
Yeah,
I actually screenshotted that because I was like, I want to try that out and then I'm gonna have that have some of my clients try some of that and see
sure.
how that works. So that's awesome. What are the biggest mistakes you see beginners making in strongman?
Oh, that's a great question. Biggest mistakes. Not prioritizing movement quality. And you could say that within accessories, deep ranges of motions. You could talk about that in terms of running mechanics. And yeah, it's just movement quality is poor and a rush for the heavier loads. Even advanced athletes, I've recently taken on a few pros from Canada and the US who, you know, their mechanics are just not good, even though they've reached pro status. They're simply not good. So dialing yourself back, regardless of where you are in your career, is incredibly important, and just creating the fundamentals to be sound. That is going to be imperative. I don't care if you could press a 385 log that looks like shit. I'd rather you press a 300-pound log that looks incredible because then I know your ceiling is increasing.
Yeah. That's crazy to like I own a gym, so like seeing like high school kids come in and like trying to like curl like the 60s and stuff and they're doing like a full body motion. It's
Yeah.
like I just watched Mitchell Hooper do curls with 30-pound dumbbells and he got way more out of that than you did on trying to
Yeah.
do the 60-pound dumbbells.
It's just movement
Yeah,
quality
yeah,
and patience. I think beginners, and when I say beginners, I'm referring to people in their first 5 years.
yeah.
Like you're a beginner in your first 5 years. Patience. Like just be slow. Go about it slow. This is a long road. And if you rush it, the the outcomes can be quite disastrous.
Probably injury.
Usually.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Talking about peaks, how long do you usually have somebody peak for? Does it depend on the athlete and their elite level?
Yeah, it does. In the perfect world, 12 weeks. Like 12 weeks is beautiful. 3 months to lead into a show is awesome. It allows me to create all the foundations that I like prior. And really, and that's the thing too, that people like everyone's focused on the peak, right? Everyone wants to talk about the peaking, the peaking, the peaking. The real stuff, because I'll be honest, peaking at a certain point is fucking easy. Like once you know your P's and Q's, peaking's easy. The real work is done 24 weeks prior to that. That's when program design is fascinating and interesting, and you can start creating these freaks. Like, I like for me, and at this point, athletes who've worked with me the longest, people like, Gabby Dixon, Lucas, and Nez, they can pretty much guess probably within an 80 to 90% accuracy what my peak is going to be for them for the
Yeah,
show. It's the other stuff. Each one of them have incredibly different off-season work. And I think that's why they've reached the levels that they've reached quite fast, is because that's probably where my skill set shines, is creating this off-season pattern and finding where their weaknesses are. But in terms of peaking, how to peak properly, because that was your question, right? How do you peak athletes?
yeah,
You basically, in a nutshell, you look at the events, you break them down where you're weak within the events. Those first 12 weeks, create complexes that are far less than what the event needs at the show, unless your own base level threshold is way higher, and just run complexes of the event. So let's use log clean and press for an example. If let's say you suffer on the clean, if you're 12 weeks out, just doing log clean and press is okay. It's
yeah,
not bad. But how about you do 2 or 3 cleans before a press, or you do a pause clean, or how about you eccentrically bring down the overhead, right? There's ways in which you could get a lot of bang for your buck, but you're not beating yourself over the head with just standard volume. Because there's only so far you can take things linearly, and even undulating, there's only so far you can take things before there's diminishing returns. And that's right around 8 to 10 weeks. So
yeah.
just like the body will fail to respond to things between 6 and 10 weeks, 8 to 10 weeks. It's not going to start yielding results. It's not going to give you more results. So you have to break things down, usually, in my opinion, in complexes because it elongates the training practice. So you quite literally practice the event
Yeah.
without overdoing it. And then when you get to those last 8 or so weeks, you can start hammering things a bit harder in a more traditional manner or more closely related to the show. So that's really kind of the big takeaway that I would give people. And I don't care if the event's deadlift, I don't care if it's overhead or running. Find the complex that addresses where you suck and
Yeah.
train it for a minimum of 4 to 6 weeks.
I know you just mentioned some eccentric work. Can you describe what eccentric work is to someone that may not know what that is?
Yeah, sure. So the eccentric pattern of a lift refers to the actual loading of the exercise. So if we use the squat as an example, on the way down, you're eccentrically loading all of the muscles related to the squat as you can, and then through the concentric method, you stand straight up, right? So if it's bench, it's on the way down. If it's deadlift, it's not on the way up, it's on the way down. Training those areas, there's quite a few studies that suggest that training yourself eccentrically or overloading the eccentric or going through a tempo with it is going to get more bang for your buck in terms of muscle acquisition, tendon health, and even skill work, in my opinion. So it's quite valuable.
Would you say you do that in the last 12 weeks of a peak, or would you do that in the previous 12 weeks?
Well, you'll
Is it
certainly
so
do the
damaging?
previous as well somewhere, building tissues and muscles. But even in the last 12 weeks, for example, leading into the Arnold with Lucas and Nez, they both had their progression for the last 8 weeks, in the first 4 weeks of the last eight. They had eccentric dips for the behind the neck jerk. So they would dip quite slowly and then express and then do their jerk, right? So what's that doing is it's forcing them to be skillful within the exercise. You have to build patterns associated with the dip and drive for success. Because any overhead, if you're split jerking at least, or even push pressing, it all comes down to the dip and drive. So creating neural pathways by just going down slower and then forcing yourself to contract is going to make you better than the last 4 weeks for them. They did nothing but expression work. It was just a standard exercise for sets and reps or to maximum.
So focusing on weaknesses, can you give us a couple exercises to improve pressing and deadlift?
Sure, yeah. Well, if you want to improve any sort of pressing, at the end of the day, pressing's a parlor trick. I don't care what anyone tells you. Work on your shoulders is not going to make you a better presser. It'll make you have healthier shoulders and you can strict more, but we're not doing strict press at shows ever, like almost ever. I mean, you can if you're that guy, but I don't suggest it.
Yeah.
Um, so the patterns associated with better pressing is going to be an incredible fixation on your dip and drive mechanics. A lot of strongmen, if you were to ask them to show you their dip and drive, they just glute bridge forward and then eventually get the weight overhead. Well, if someone asked you to give them a vertical throw, or sorry, pardon me, a vertical jump, would you jump forward? Well, no. Well, that's exactly what most strongmen do with their dip and drive, right? So the mechanics need to change to a quad based, really loading phase. So doing things like tempo dips, like I suggested,
Yeah.
pause dips, and then forcing yourself to extend through your quads and not your hips is going to ultimately lend towards massive success for getting things over your noggin. And that's a big one. So for
What about deadlift?
deadlifts,
Any
well, it depends on where the people are weak. You know, most strong men will never miss deadlifts past their knees because they have strong backs and hips, right? So
yeah.
for them, it's going to be usually work off the floors where most strong men will miss a load or a deadlift, I should say. So for them, it's going to be a lot of deficit works, pause work, pulling against pins to create just neurological power output, and then going into a deadlift. It's more of a contrast system there. So there's lots of ways you can manipulate that. But I would say that the basics would be pauses and deficits.
Perfect.
Because ultimately, you just need to know how to use your quads off the ground.
Yeah. Yeah. How do you program for endurance and stamina while maintaining your maximal strength?
That's fair. Well, like, again, the answer is it depends on the athlete, right? But generally speaking, just like your strength training and hypertrophy and all that stuff, you know, it's peaks and valleys, and there's a bit of a linear chart, regardless if you're going up or down leading into a show. Conditioning is the exact same way. So the further you are from a show, you want your base, your body's ability to have maximal conditioning to be wide. So a lot of zone two conditioning, or just which is basically like, you know, running or on a bike or whatever tool you want to use. If you could barely carry a conversation, you're usually in zone two, is kind of how I tell people. And just doing long duration work there, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 40 minutes, an hour, building that base nice and wide. That's not going to really interfere with your training, especially when you're that far out, right? When you're that far out, you're usually doing higher rep stuff anyway. So it's actually going to lend towards success. And as the show gets closer, you get a little bit more poignant with your conditioning in the form of sprints and utilizing ATP threshold stuff. So going fast for short bursts. Like, so long as you're not just hammering, you know, an infinite amount of sprints or going for way too long of cardio as the show gets closer, you're going to be able to manage that fatigue quite well. And it will lend towards success with the maximal lifts because the more conditioned you are, the faster you could recover for heavier lifts.
Do you have any tips for recovery after like a multiple event session? Like is there anything that you have people do like right after? Is there
I
anything like that?
mean, assuming their nutrition's on point and they're not eating fast food every day, the best thing you could do is sleep. Like you need to sleep and sleep a lot. That's number one. That is more important than any drug, than any food source, than any vitamin. You have to sleep. It's incredibly important.
Do you have any tips on how to optimize your sleep? Like do
Oh
you
man.
like dark room, cold room,
Yeah, I mean, it's the basics
things
that
like
anyone
that?
could research. Keep your room dark as hell, slightly colder than you want. Sleeping in a slightly colder room than you want actually lends towards greater recovery. And you know, try not to be too dependent on things like melatonin that will disrupt your circadian rhythm if overused. But ultimately, just, you know, get off your damn phone an hour before you intend to sleep and stay away from the TV and computer and go to bed.
Okay, perfect. How do you optimize pre-workout and post-workout nutrition for strength and recovery? Do the Lucas's and Inez's like nutrition and stuff, or do they have somebody else for that?
Well, I optimize it by having people hire people who are incredible at that. But funny enough, I actually do handle Lewis's nutrition. Funny enough, which I don't normally do, nor do I offer, nor do I advertise. I understand the basics of nutrition, but it's just
Yeah.
not a field that, I am passionate about being a strength coach. I'm not passionate about nutrition, so I'd much rather than work with a professional. But me and Lucas have a pretty good working relationship, and I mean, to optimize it, you just have to make sure you're hitting the basic macros at a proficient level for performance. Carbohydrates aren't your enemy. Eating as many meals as you can that you made at home is going to be a priority, and having a pretty strong amount of protein is just going to allow you to recover from these sessions, right? That's nutrition's, if I'm being honest, pretty fucking easy in that sense. It's more the hyper specificities of like vitamins and like vitamins on the day as well is really important. So like
Hmm.
ensuring that, oh look, Nez is calling me. Ensuring that people have like sufficient minerals and things like that is incredibly important. Magnesium and all that stuff, it's incredibly important. So ultimately, I always suggest people work with a nutritionist, but the basics aren't really too complicated. It's honestly, it's kind of simple. Just don't be a dick. It's kind of the golden rule.
Okay. Do you have any like best supplements for strongman athletes or any strength sport? Uh, anything you recommend?
Yeah, B12s and magnesium and creatine every day.
Okay.
Every fucking day.
Every day.
Every day. Regardless of weight class as well.
What do you think on the recovery techniques like sauna and cold plunging and stuff like that? Do you think that's helpful or do you think that's kind of bullshit?
Listen, when it comes to like stuff like that, massage, sauna, dry needling, whatever, there's some things that have more acute effects than others. Like, dry needling and massage tends to have a bit more of an acute effect, right? That's pretty tangible. But, plunges, hot rooms and all that, the golden rule is anything that's going to get you into a parasympathetic state is going to work, right? So if that means you have to jump your ass in a cold pool and a hot tub, cool, do it. That's fine. If it means you're just going to watch a movie and go to bed, do that too.
Cool.
That's awesome. Like there isn't any must-haves in that regard, in my opinion. And and to be perfectly honest, the further you are away from a show, the less I would do things like cold plunge, just because ultimately that is going to slow down the inflammation process, and you need inflammation to get jacked. That is a part of the healing system. So, the closer you are to a show, 8, 12 weeks, whatever, I think it's fine. So long, if it relaxes you and it makes you calm and you can sleep better, do it. There's no real wrong answer there.
Cool. What's your opinion on hydration? I know you just mentioned the vitamins and all that stuff super important. Uh, is there certain vitamins for hydration that you recommend on like competition day?
Yeah, the minerals that I suggested, things like magnesium, it's incredibly important to retain. That will help you retain hydration within your cells. Like and the creatine as well. It's going to flood your cells with water and allow for greater production and I should say greater utilization of the nutrients that you're taking in.
How do you keep clients who struggle? How do you help clients who struggle with motivation? I know you deal with a lot of elite people, so they have that goal, so they may not struggle with motivation, but they may sometimes feel behind or anything.
Yeah.
How do you help them or help them with that
Well,
struggle?
I think one thing that's incredibly important, and this goes for the like amateur shows to shows like Strongest Man on Earth or Arnold. At the end of the day, you're doing this for you, right? This is not for anyone else. You have to be doing this for you. And when I say that, it doesn't even mean doing it for a title or a certain podium position. Like your goal, I don't care who you are, every time you go into a show is to beat the numbers you did in the gym, right? So if you're constantly comparing yourself to yourself, you're going to find greater um, appreciation for what you're doing, and that will create longevity, right? So you never fixate on another competitor or a record or a certain result. You have to fixate on yourself and the minor progress you're making along the way. And that's just gonna make the journey far more enjoyable, to be honest. Like it doesn't matter if someone hit 20 kilos more than you. If you keep on just chipping away
Yeah,
for you, before you know it, a couple of years go by and suddenly you're the best, or
yeah.
you could be, right? So that's ultimately what you have to remind athletes in a coaching position for it, whether it's someone like Lucas or someone who's an amateur in the local scene.
What's one piece of advice you wish every gym goer would follow?
Um, I just don't be scared to ask for help, you know. And at times you're gonna get help that sucks and it's not good, and you just smile and nod. But asking for help, generally speaking, is always going to be okay. Very rarely is someone gonna say no to someone in the gym if they're asking for help.
Yeah. I would agree with that. Most people would be what I would say are like scared to approach somebody that's like a bodybuilder or doing a
Yeah,
specific
sure.
sport, but they're probably the one that's going to be most likely to help you if you
Yeah,
actually ask for it. So
yeah, and it ultimately it's just it also it lends towards environmental change, enjoying the community aspects. Just ask for help. People are willing.
yeah, what are some essential technique cues for the log press to maximize efficiency and power?
For the log press. Well, it goes right back to what I was saying before with the dip and drive mechanics. Like you have to practice that every day. I don't. It doesn't matter if you're someone like Iron Bibby, who could just strict press, a 220 log, kilo log. Uh, I'd make the same argument to him. You could be pressing way more if your dip and drive didn't suck, right? Like even someone like him, his dip and drive is terrible,
Yeah,
but he's so fucking strong. He invested so heavily in the natural talents in his shoulders that he could get away with it. And that's really cool. Good for you. But there's always room to get better. I don't care who you are.
yeah. What's the best way to train the yoke carry for speed and stability? Are there any things you do with the hips and the knees to help with stability on the yoke?
Yeah, of course. I mean, at the end of the day, like your legs are the ones doing the running, right? And your spine is bearing your load. So having incredible, that's what I was going back to before. I was talking about like incredible movement quality. If you could do split squats that look perfect and deep lunges and perfect squats and perfect hinging mechanics, you're more likely going to have greater success when it comes to things like yoke, and you're going to be faster because you're stronger in all ranges. So for the yoke, and this I would say, I don't care what level you are, stop running heavy yoke weekly. If you're running heavy yoke weekly, you're fucking up. And I don't even care if you're really good at the yoke. You'll get so much more out of it undulating it bi-weekly, whether it's heavy and light, things like that, or just doing it every 2 weeks, period, right? I think, for the yoke at Arnold UK that Lucas ran, it was yoke into dumbbell. I think we did yoke twice in 12 weeks. And that's one, you could get away with that once you reach a certain level of skill
Yeah,
with the actual event, right? So it takes time to build to that skill, but it's also a way to preserve the body because yoke is fucking hard.
yeah.
It's going to compress your spine. Your feet are probably going to hurt. It's just a very hard movement. So training it bi-weekly and undulating the intensities is going to save your ass.
Yeah. How do you approach breathing and bracing techniques for different events? Do you think you need to breathe and brace differently on events or
Yeah, it
the same
depends.
movement?
It's a bit of a big question.
Yeah.
I mean, ultimately, if you want to be good at strength sport as a whole, you have to master a Valsalva, right? You have to master what it is to fill your diaphragm with air, not your chest, your diaphragm. And then from there, know how to manipulate where your top rib and your pelvis is in space while holding that brace. And if you can master those two areas, most things are quite similar. Like you might take a breath at different spots during an event, like maybe at the top of a log clean or you're sitting in the bottom of a stone lat position, but the brace pretty much has to stay the same.
Yeah.
And knowing where to initiate the brace is incredibly important because at the end of the day, all sports are done in extension, which is quite literally the opposite of what I just suggested. But knowing how to brace regardless is going to keep that extension safe.
Are there any physical therapy things that you do for lower back and shoulder issues? I know uh, the sport of strongman can really have a
Yeah. It can beat you up.
yeah,
Things that allow for some folks, decompression is good, whether it be hanging upside down or chiropractic manipulation. And for some people, decompression will fuck them up worse, right? So I'm one of those people where I will not decompress because it actually will make my back way worse. Which, if you're in that camp, you have an issue of stability, right? Your QLs, your abdomens, your certain parts of your spine aren't functioning in a way that they should to provide stability. So doing simple practices like side planks and loaded planks and certain ab exercises will help you instill that. And even, well, hip bridging to where you're working your QL allows for that stability to kick on, and then you could go about your day. For those that need decompression, well, you do the things I suggested. Manual manipulation is always fine. But ultimately, you know, you have to just be strong and
yeah.
you have to load properly over the course of years to avoid those issues. So, for example, if you're someone who's constantly in extension, like I mentioned, and you don't know how to brace, well, your lower back's not going to last for very long. So, learning how to not be in that extension, doing, the basic things like bird dogs and glute bridges, whatever, is great and that will help. But you ultimately have to start lifting with those techniques in mind.
How do you incorporate GPP into a workout program?
Yeah, so GPP, general physical preparedness, which is just a term for like more reps, higher tissue quality. Usually something gets done further away from a show, right? So the whole program, it's not necessarily how do you incorporate it into the program. That is the program when you're that far out. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
like you do things like EMOMs or sets of 20 and whatever, like more higher rep things, more locomotion work sometimes depending on the athlete. Um, it's just be willing to step away far. The more important lesson here is if you're an athlete, if you're, 24 weeks out or whatever, be willing to step away far from what heavy is
Yeah.
just to train qualities because you're building the house, you're building the base. So in which case you can be far stronger later, and that's really kind of what it is.
Yeah, that's that pyramid. The base is down here, and then you're gonna kind of go
Yeah,
up towards the top.
yeah, and the wider the base, the higher the pyramid, right? The higher the peak.
Louis Simmons.
Yeah,
Are there any fitness trends you think are complete nonsense?
complete nonsense. Well, I try to be a person that I try to be a person that can see the value in most things, but you know what? Sure, this and for strongman, this would be controversial, but I love it anyway. That's probably what I'll say it. The tsunami bar is total bullshit. It's
Okay.
it's
Yeah.
it's absolute bullshit. It's nonsense. It will not make your overhead better. It will not make your squats better. It's a total gimmick.
It's just for views.
It's just a gimmick. It's a bendy bar that makes it harder to lift a weight, which is not going to inherently improve the skill that you're working on.
Yeah, I feel like that would
In
make
fact,
it
I would
even.
make the argument it'll make your overhead worse.
Yeah, I don't see like what the point of that is. I feel
Yeah,
like it
as
would
much
throw
as
you
as
off.
much as Nicholas Camby will, his heart will be broken by me saying this. I would argue that the overhead, for example, if I were to use that as an example, it will actually make it worse. At the end of the day, to master overhead, you have to hit the same positions over and over with high movement quality. Well, if you have this external stimulus that is forcing you to move in ways in which does not lend towards that skill, you're detraining the skill. You're training a different skill entirely now. It's not even related. So, because at no show will you go to is the axle or the log going to bend. So why are we wasting time here?
Yeah.
How about you just get really good at the dip and drive and get stronger? Yeah, it is what it is. So
Yeah.
yeah, tsunami bar, that's my hot take. It's bullshit.
If you could change anything in the fitness industry or strongman, what would you change? Is there a rule that you don't like? Is there I mean just anything that you would if you were.
I would say, you know, as I've coached from amateur shows to the big four now, um, I think people would be alarmed at the lack of professionalism at some of the big four. Not Rogue or Shaw. Those shows are perfect. But I would say things like rules meeting need to be addressed and improved. Things like um, just, just the basics, like the basics. It's interesting. The further these big shows have gotten from the basics, like the amateur shows, some things have fallen by the wayside, and that's what I would like to see that improved. And besides that, I'm not going to make comments on personalities and stuff because everyone's their own person and they have different ways
Yeah.
to express themselves. But I would say the basics need to be more sound at some of the higher level shows.
Okay. What's the biggest misconception people have about strongman?
I think because the sh ultimately, if you get popular in the United States, you're going to be popular worldwide, right? And it's not always vice versa. If you're really popular in Zambia, whether it's a sport or a music, whatever, it doesn't mean you're going to be quite popular in the US, right? So I think some of the biggest misconceptions because World's Strongest Man was taken out of the US and purchased by a major conglomerate and essentially put in the hands of well, made more popular by a UK company. Um, the perception in the US isn't as appreciated as it is overseas or in Europe, right? So I would say the biggest misconception, if I'm going to speak from an American point of view, is it isn't the best strength sport by fucking miles, because it is. It is there isn't another strength sport that's even close to the qualities that are being tested here to find the true strongest humans in the world. And I'm a former Olympic weightlifting coach and I love that, but it isn't like I don't know, back in the day and really up into the early 2010s, the commentators at the Olympics or whatever would refer to the winner of the open men in weightlifting as the strongest man in the world or the world's strongest man. And
Yeah.
that used to be the case, but I think hopefully with the proliferation of the sport in the US, what you'll find is that this is truly the greatest test of human capability in terms of maximal strength and even locomotive production. So that's what I would say.
What's your personal coaching philosophy when it comes to building athletes? Is there any
Personal,
mentors that you had?
yeah, I had plenty of mentors. That's a different question, right? Personal philosophy, do not allow your feelings to dictate the outcome, is my coaching personal philosophy. And that doesn't mean you ignore how you feel or you bash yourself over the head for not being tough enough. That's actually the furthest from what I mean. I mean, ultimately, there are times where you're going to feel good and there are times you're going to feel bad. Both should not dictate the outcome. Your ethics and your work and skill work in the gym and at home, that should determine your outcome. So if there's times in which you're feeling bad about yourself or even good about yourself, if that practice isn't high, well, it means nothing because your outcomes are probably not going to be that good. So I would say don't let your feelings get in the way of what you're actually doing.
Awesome. I've loved that. I've never heard that before. What's one training belief or approach you had early in your career, but that has completely changed now?
A belief. Huh. Well, it's not so much of a belief, but more of a methodology. I used to be a real hard ass. And I think as I've progressed as a coach, I've been coaching for about 15 years now, which is rare for someone my age. I just happen to find the industry really young. Um, you have to meet people where they're at. And there are a multitude of ways to skin a cat. There's not a one try all, or it's not just a one thing fits all type of mentality. And as a coach, you have to be willing to communicate and program in ways that make you uncomfortable because it's not what you know to works. And then you need to find the uncomfortable part of that and make it work. And once you kind of reach that point, whether it's dealing with strong personalities or weak personalities or in the middle, you start to really start pulling results out of people that they didn't think were possible, or maybe you didn't even think were possible.
Yeah.
That's probably what I would say.
How do you determine when an athlete should push through fatigue versus when they should back off?
Movement quality. I watch the movement quality. There are times where, someone like Nez or Lucas will call in the gym, like, I don't feel good today. And I'll just watch how they're moving. Like, and I'll tell them, yes, you are. You're moving great. You're going to hit this PR that you don't think you can.
Yeah,
And they
sometimes
do.
that's why you video. That's why you
Yeah,
video.
you have to video. It's movement quality. And if things start falling off the rails and there's energy leaks here and there, then yeah, it's time for you to back the hell off.
What are some habits outside the gym that separate elite strongmen from average competitors?
Yeah, I mean that's really what it is. It's not the gym that defines someone. It's really what they're doing outside. I'd say nutrition and lifestyle. It's really just lifestyle that covers the full umbrella. Like to be successful in this sport, if your goal is to be successful, and that could be whatever it means for you. It could be, hey, I want to take top five at a local show or whatever. Your quality of life has to be your priority. So maybe it's meal prepping, maybe it's making sure you're getting 8 hours of sleep, maybe it's ensuring that you're surrounding yourself with people that fulfill you as a human being. That's a huge component. That's why I mean on my athlete intake form, one of the questions I ask is, are you married or not? Having a partner that supports you is incredibly paramount. Having a partner that doesn't will diminish returns, right? So you have to curate your lifestyle for this thing.
Yeah. My coach, we talked about that on the first podcast. He was saying, your partner is a huge deal, and
Yeah.
the fatigue and stress management. If you're having fights all the time and you're not doing all that, like that stress still accumulates in your body, and your body can't tell you which stress is which. It's still going to affect you.
It's all the same.
Yeah, it's all the same. You're not going to have stress from your life. It's it's going to carry over into the gym. So
Yeah.
managing that is super
Yeah,
important.
getting into a fight with your girlfriend, you might as well be maxing out a deadlift and missing. It's the
Yeah,
same effect on the body.
yeah. What are the most important mobility drills for strongman or Olympic weightlifters? Is there anything that you
No,
really?
honestly, not to interrupt you, pardon me. It goes right back to that initial thing that people aren't doing as well. High movement quality. If you want to be hypermobile and you want to be proficient in your skills, make sure you're doing those skills with incredible range of motion. That's really the best thing you can do. And sure, there's lots of different things you could do to help with that, whether it be couch stretches and dead bugs and kettlebell get-ups and swings and all that shit. And that stuff works. It's fine. But you have to do this skill with extreme proficiency, and that is the best thing you could do.
What are your go-to warm-ups for a heavy day?
The exercise is going to be heavy, done well. That's genuinely that's what it is.
Do you do like anything? Do you do just what you're going to be doing for the warm up, or do you?
Yeah, of course, there's basic warm-ups I write in, but that's not what's important. Like, sure, you do hops and bounds and swings and hinges and the McGill Big Three and all that shit, and that's great. Do that stuff. It makes you
Yeah,
feel good, but like, you have to do your skill. You have to do your sport with high skill. That is the best thing you can do.
I got about 10 rapid fire questions for you. I'll see
Rapid
what
fire.
rapid fire. What's your favorite strongman event?
Oh man, I'm slow and rapid, aren't I? I really love them all except for grip. Grip is whack. Let's play stone loading.
Still noting.
Sure.
What's the heaviest thing you've ever lifted?
Heaviest thing I've ever lifted? I mean,
Yep.
things like yoke shouldn't really count. I'm not particularly impressive as an athlete. I mean, I have like a 635 deadlifts. I've done 330 for reps on overhead. Like, I'm not particularly strong. Pretty average, I would say.
What's the most underrated exercise for strongman training?
Underrated. A high quality squat.
High quality squat. What's what's Lucas's go-to meal before a big event?
Honestly, the same thing you eat every day, which is rice and steak or rice and chicken.
What's the worst injury you've ever seen in a strongman competition?
The worst that I personally have seen.
Yeah.
Um, I've been lucky. I haven't seen a lot of bad stuff, but
Okay.
I've seen quite a few bicep detachments.
Okay. I mean,
Yeah,
that still sucks for the person, but
still sucks. Yeah,
who's your favorite strongman of all time?
Vitalis Lalas.
What's the hardest event in strongman in your opinion?
Squat for reps.
Squat for reps. If you could give one piece of advice to someone wanting to start and compete in strongman, what would it be?
Patience. Take your time. Just take your time. That's it.
Yeah, I think patience for the whole process. No matter what you're doing, you should just need to
Go
start.
slow.
Yep, go slow.
Yeah.
Well, Alec, I have no more questions for you.
Oh, is that everything? Is
We
that
got we
everything?
got through everything, man.
That's so fast. 'Cause I see this long list here. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. I mean, I very much appreciate you having me on, and ultimately, I hope this stuff helps people. I mean,
yeah,
it's
yeah. I had a couple hundred listeners on the first two combined, or I mean, 100
oh, did you
each. So
really?
yeah, I've had a bunch of people. I've had messages from people on social media saying that they listened and they learned a lot of stuff. So
Great.
I really appreciate your time and getting on here. And where can people follow you at?
I just use Instagram at this point. I don't post a lot like I used to, which I maybe I should. I don't know. To be perfectly honest, I'm not a fan of social media, but I used Instagram and it's just Alec Jose.
Perfect. Well, good luck to you and Lucas at World's Strongest Man.
Thanks, buddy. It's gonna be a great time. The events are cool. I can't really share them, but I'll give a hint because why not? I'll end the show with a high note.
Perfect. Perfect.
Um, there is carryover from the Arnold to this show.
Okay. Carryover from the Arnold to this show.
I'll leave it at
Okay.
that.
Perfect. Now you got me thinking.
Yeah.
Well, Alex, I really appreciate your time.
Appreciate your time as well, buddy. And I hope to watch future episodes as well. Hope it keeps going and grows for you.
Yep. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Perfect.